Welcome everybody to the first panel of today's Science Fiction Symposium. Just want to echo Justin and Jason's remarks, and again, welcome everybody for joining us here today. We're really excited to have this discussion with you all and to bring in folks from, again, around the globe. It's one of the silver linings of doing this virtually, so we're really excited to have today's initial session on archival research. Just a few quick words about housekeeping. If you weren't here when Jason was talking about how it's going to work, we will have our three panelists give their papers. We will go in the order that they are listed in the program. I will briefly introduce them, but you can read more about them and their amazing work in the program on the City Tech Symposium website. We really encourage your participation and engagement with the panelist presentations. So at any point throughout the presentation, feel free to ask questions that you would like to have raised to our panelists. You can do that using the Q&A feature in the webinar. We also want to invite everybody to also just make free use of the chat in the Zoom to just make comments or share encouragement or ask questions or engage with the other panelists. Please note that while you can make comments or ask questions at any point throughout the session, I will hold them till all panelists have spoken and we will have a full time for discussion at the end. I will keep people to 15 minutes for their papers. And we'll go from there. So we're going to get started. I realize I forgot to introduce myself. So I'm Jill Belli. I'm an associate professor of English here at City Tech and one of the co-organizers of the Science Fiction Symposium. And again, just really excited to welcome you here. We've been having a long-standing conversation about inclusion and access and race within science fiction for the past few years, and we're going to continue that this year with a focus specifically on the archive. Friendly reminder also that you can be sharing your content and ideas more broadly through the internet. The hashtags for the symposium are CityTechSF and SF Archive. I'll throw those in the chat. And I would just invite our panelists to share any contact information or Twitter handles or anything they want in the chat as well, if you'd like to raise that there. And my own is JBelli13. I'll put that there as well. Okay, so let's get started. So our first presenter is Jessica Aaron. I'm really excited to have her here. She's a third-year undergraduate student at the University of Chicago. We are so excited to see undergraduate participation in here. And her paper is entitled "Preventing Planetary Patriarchy: Subversions of the White Man's Ideal World in Early SF Pulps." So Jessica, whenever you're ready.
Awesome, thank you. Hi, everyone. As she said, my name is Jessica Aaron, and my project is called Preventing Planetary Patriarchy: Subversions of the White Man's Ideal World in the Early Science Fiction Pulps. I conducted this research project at the University of Chicago under the supervision of Dr. Catherine Buse. My research on this project consisted of reading through pulp science fiction stories published in magazines between 1920 and 1949, and combing through these stories for planetary speculations. Among the stories, I noticed a pattern in those which expressed feminist perspectives. And from that, I discovered that alongside critiques of the patriarchy, these feminist stories also tended to express themes of anti-racism and anti-colonialism as well, in what I identify as an early form of what would now be called intersectional feminism. This was a surprising discovery because mainstream feminism of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s was dominated by white middle-class perspectives. And so the intersectional approach of feminist pulp authors appears to be a unique phenomenon for its time. This talk will examine the way this intersectionality manifested, first by exploring the greater pulp background of the time, looking at what I call the white man's ideal world. This was the planetary model created by many typical white male science fiction pulp authors, which idealized patriarchy and white supremacy. I'll then provide an overview of the feminist approach to planetary world building and how it fits into the category of intersectional feminism. I decided to focus on planets for my project because to me they present a particularly clear manifestation of a speculative subsection of science fiction. Speculative fiction is a term I draw from Alexis Lothian's Old Futures, where she defines speculation as the, quote, act of imagining things otherwise than they are and of creating stories from that impulse, end quote. Extraterrestrial planets during the 1920s and 30s were used to manifest this otherwise as a direct contrast to our Earth. In some stories, the planet was Earth-like with slightly inhuman inhabitants or a chemically changed but still breathable atmosphere. In other stories, the more fundamentally Earth-like qualities were reimagined, which produced planets with poisonous chlorine atmospheres or cavernous interiors. In addition to allowing for changed physical characteristics, speculative planetary fiction also allowed authors to explore the social other. Science fiction authors of this time developed methods to imagine alternate worlds built off planetary conditions. They could extrapolate from the little that was scientifically known at the time about Mars or Venus and use those environmental factors to create unique sociopolitical conditions. These authors could make their society with great wealth disparities by imagining a few privately owned precious metal mines on the planet. They could make their society insular by placing predatory creatures around their world, or make it small by fabricating a natural disaster a few decades in the past. These authors learned how to build the social world according to their wishes by changing the parameters of the physical world, which the genre of planetary fiction enabled them to do. In many of these texts, this world took the form of what I call the white man's ideal world, or the idealized society created by a field that was mostly white male authors, in which white men retained their societal supremacy, even in the future on far-off planets. This colonialism and misogyny present in early science fiction literature should not be particularly surprising. As scholars such as John Reeder, Lisa Yazek, and Helen Merrick have noted, a majority of stories in science fiction pulp magazines like Amazing Stories and Wonder Stories were written by white men and expressed racist, colonialist, and sexist sympathies. Among these sympathies, there were a lot of common themes I found in my survey of planetary pulp stories. Some were about humans introducing their customs into an alien society in order to civilize the aliens and carry on the white man's burden. These often included themes of exploiting the resources of a planet or an alien civilization, in many cases against the will of the native alien people, in order to achieve economic prosperity for the colonizers. A significant example of this theme is the story By Jove by Walter Rose, in which the human protagonists save the friendly Grack race of Jupiter by irrigating the desert they live in and solving their water crisis. They also slaughter the enemies of the Gracks and commend themselves for carrying out, and I quote, "the white man's burden in excelsis." There are also stories that end with the genocide of an entire race, because the protagonists identified that race as wholly evil, although in these stories we never actually see the other race's perspective. An example of this is the story When the Moons Met by Clyde F. Beck, a story which won an award in 1930 from Hugo Gernsback as he worked to cultivate the developing genre of science fiction. Gernsback saw this work as exemplary of his vision for science fiction, yet the story ends in an unapologetic genocide. In the story, after instantly determining the Carcorean race is evil, the main character develops the idea to, quote, "derange the orbit of Carcor so as to cause it and Tandal, the other planet, to come together and allow the poison-laden atmosphere of Tandal to mingle with that of Carcor. Thus, the universe would be rid at a single blow of the menace of the diabolical Carcorians." We're never presented with a Carcorian perspective and are led to believe they're diabolical only because that is the narrator's first impression of them. Now, another theme I found was a lot of damsels in distress. Paul Ernst's Red Hell of Jupiter, Arthur Stanglin's 50th Century Revolt, Edwin Sloat's The Three Sons of Ed. In all of these stories, the woman is either the protagonist's love interest or the daughter of the main scientist, and in most cases serves the sole role of giving the protagonist something to fight for by crying and screaming for help whenever she's in trouble. These themes of colonization, racism, and sexism match what Reeder, Yazek, Merrick, and other scholars of science fiction have identified, a prevalence of early science fiction written by white men to place white men on top of the social ladder. Among the dozens of white man's ideal world stories I read throughout this research project, I also encountered a few stories which seemed to originate from a feminist perspective. I didn't apply as rigorous a definition of feminism for these stories as I would for a modern example. Rather, what I accepted as feminist was roughly a story where there was a female character with motivations or desires independent of the male characters. In many stories, there was only one woman, and even in stories where she was independent of the man and a little badass, she would still often be repeatedly differentiated by her appearance, by her sleek black hair or doe eyes. But the feminist aspect of these stories was that the woman was not defined by her appearance or the way she interacted with the male characters. She was her own person, which certainly seems like a bare minimum standard for feminism, but which I found necessary to apply when examining popular science fiction from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Among the interplanetary stories I examined in the Pulps, there were a few which appear to be written from this feminist perspective. A prominent example of this is the story The Conquest of Gola by Leslie F. Stone, one of the first female authors to write for the Pulps. The planet Gola is a matriarchal society that is technologically powerful. A few human men visit Gola, hoping to add it to their galactic federation and establish an exploitative trade deal, which would benefit the Earth a lot more than Gola. Here, Stone greatly challenges the typical narrative, as the Golan queen notes a very low level of intelligence in these Earthmen. When asked how unintelligent beings could build the big, impressive spaceships that took them to Gola, the queen replies, quote, "None aboard them did that. I don't question it, but that their mothers built the ships for them," end quote. Here, Stone challenges the typical narrative of the scientifically advanced man by presenting a perspective in which the scientifically advanced woman is the default. The Conquest of Gola is very explicitly feminist in a way not often found in the early science fiction pulps. But what made it so unique, besides its feminist perspective, was how strongly anti-colonial the story was. The humans are thoroughly portrayed as the bad guys in the story, and their entire mission is to colonize and exploit Gola. The narrator, Golan woman, is also meant to be received sympathetically by the reader. She's very critical of the colonial attitudes of the Earthmen, believing their exploitation to be ignoble and shameful. A lot of the white man's ideal world stories portray this colonial dynamic from the Earthman's perspective. In these stories, man is the alien planet's savior, bringing them economic prosperity in exchange for the use of their land and resources. Stone's story is therefore a subversion of this typical narrative, challenging the idea that a human conquest of other planets is heroic or honorable. This trend of feminist stories critiquing other socio-political issues continued throughout the other pulp stories, expressing a similarly feminist perspective. The Hell Planet, another story by Leslie Stone, presents a more metaphorical critique of colonialism, as the men in her story are on a mining expedition on the fictional planet Vulcan and die from radium poisoning. This can be interpreted as dying from their hubris in trying to exploit Vulcan's radium mines. Stone ends the story with a warning message, saying, quote, that man's damnable desire to conquer will leave them like pigs for the slaughter, end quote. Homer Eon Flint's The Devolutionist is similarly feminist in that it features a female doctor as a well-developed protagonist. Her husband is an official in their autocratic government of their planet Hafen, and he decides to falsely claim that their neighboring planet Alma is facing starvation and plans to invade and conquer Hafen. In reality, Alma is incredibly advanced and appears to be a very peaceful planet. So his purpose for telling this lie is to produce a false justification for invading Alma, so as to secure their chemical resources. His wife is incredibly critical of his portrayal of Alma, calling him a scoundrel and attempting to encourage rebellion against him. Other feminist stories critique the categorization of certain races as inferior, or extreme violence against aliens, or fascism. What all these stories have in common is that they are intersectional in their approach to feminism. Intersectional feminism is a term coined by law professor Kimberly Crenshaw during the 1980s. She defines it as, quote, a prism for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exacerbate each other, unquote. The mainstream feminism of the early 20th century was not intersectional in the way Crenshaw defines it, due to its exclusion of minority women. This is apparent when considering the fact that Black women didn't really get the right to vote until years after white women, because mainstream feminism believed securing the right to vote alone was sufficient, and thus did not account for barriers which still prevented minority women from voting. Starting in around the 1920s, women's suffrage was a movement carried on mostly by Black women alone, because the organizations who had led the movement disbanded after achieving voting rights for white women. For these reasons, the feminism found in the pulps was unusual for its time. Feminist intersectionality was uncommon during the 1920s and 30s, yet within the pulps, feminism interacted with questions of racial, social, economic inequality in order to attack broader narratives of injustice by addressing multiple aspects of the white man's ideal world. This begs the question, why were the early pulps intersectional? After all the feminist authors I found in the pulps are white. Since a majority of the white first-wave feminists did not express a concern for racial justice, why did the pulp authors bring up topics of racism and colonialism when the mainstream movement didn't? I believe the answer to this lies in the systematicity of planetary world building. What I mean by a world being systematic is that all its characteristics are contained within a single coherent framework. These characteristics interact with one another within the system, which I argue is the case for the misogyny and colonialism of the white man's ideal world. Both these factors serve to put the white man in a position of superiority, giving him power over vast groups of people. I argue that feminist authors were primarily concerned with dismantling the system of power as a whole, because they believed the best way to boost the social standing of women was to bring the men at the top of the social ladder down off their thrones. To do that, they had to subvert the entire foundation of the white man's power and to challenge the sexism as well as the racism and colonialism of the white man's superiority. I've always been a fan of science fiction because it's all about exploring possibilities. It expands the limits of what we currently know to produce futures that are in many respects plausible, but also vastly different from our own world. Moreover, it gives authors the chance to express their hopes, visions, ideals for the future. And this is why the intersectionality of feminism in these texts is so significant. Science fiction during the pulp era was a very public medium. Its audience was anyone able to afford a 25-cent magazine, and the letter columns of the magazines reveal the readers to be men and women of varying ages from different countries and with very different perspectives on the texts. Feminist authors were able to reach these wide audiences through these magazines, and therefore their ideal futures full of feminism, racial justice, and anti-colonialism received exposure in the wide-ranging pulps. Within the scope of this project, I was unable to research the exact impact of these texts on readers, since very few of the feminist stories were commented on in the magazine reader letter columns, and secondary literature is sparse for a lot of early pulp stories. Therefore, it's impossible for me to comment on what exactly the practical impact was of the introduction of intersectional feminism into the pulps. In this project, I also only focused on mainstream American and English pulps up to this point, which are primarily written by white authors. A direction I'd like to take this project in the future is examining the conversations about sexism and racism published in non-stream, perhaps the Black pulps of the time, looking at them in juxtaposition with the limited white mainstream perspective that I focused on so far. Regardless, the presence of intersectional feminism in the science fiction pulps, a medium so devoted to expressing notions of a better societally advanced future, reveals that intersectional feminism was an ideal held by at least some people during the early 20th century, and was afforded a small space in the literature of science fiction futures before it became integrated into the mainstream feminist movement itself. Thank you.
Trying to clap and unmute at the same time. Jessica, thank you so much for that fascinating paper. So much to discuss there. And I look forward to continuing the conversation at the end of all these presentations. We're going to continue now with our second presenter, who is Chris Leslie, who is a visiting professor in the School of Foreign Languages at the South China University of Technology in Guangzhou. We are really excited to have him here with us today, presenting on the Republic of Interstellar Letters from the archives of Asimov and Merril. So Chris, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Jill, and thank you, Jason, and Mo the cat, and everybody who has worked so hard to bring us here together. I'm going to see if I can share my screen, and I think that is working. Today, I'll be addressing some of the archival research that I have been doing in preparation for my current book project. In the course of this project, I was sort of interested in the same question that Jessica was, which is, how do you know how people felt about the stories that they were reading? And that led me to do a search of Arthur's archives. And as I continued on this work and trying to think about the ways in which insights into diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM could help us to understand early science fiction better, it became a very interesting conversation that I was having with these authors. So the Gernsbacks and the Heinleins seem to be presenting this view that Jessica was talking about, this idea of the sort of white man's superiority in civilization as being some sort of a marker of their excellence. And these authors like Leslie Stone and people like C.L. Moore, Lee Brackett, and Judith Merrill, who were these dissenting voices. So I'm happy to say that this project is coming to a conclusion and should be coming out by Palgrave next year. So in doing this work, I became sort of upset with the idea of close reading. If you remember, people like Paul Demand saying that you shouldn't ever use an author's intentions for literary analysis. This becomes a difficult thing when you're looking into authors' archives. And there's a very sort of thin line between biographical criticism. I know that Judith Merrill wanted to say these things, right? And analyzing the authorial persona, which is the sort of way in which authors like Judith Merrill presented themselves as sort of public figures. And this has been with me through this project, and it's an interesting way, I think, to imagine the resources that we have and imagine their place in scholarship. So just to start with a couple of stories about Isaac Asimov. As you know, Isaac Asimov got his start through working with John W. Campbell, who was then editor of Astounding Science Fiction. And in recent years, Campbell's reputation has rightly been challenged. And there has really not been a shortage of objectionable words from Campbell. And it just seems like these ideas were, some of his problematic ideas were glossed over. But we can definitely find, like Harry Harrison's collected editorials from Analog. Also, there was an effort to publish all of Campbell's letters, which was completed on microfilm, and selections from these letters were published in a hardcover book. There's only 3 copies that I can find of the microfilm, which makes it hard to use, right? And the text version only has 300. But as I was doing my archival research, I started to find some strange things. Asimov started donating his papers to the Boston University in 1964. And as I was going through these letters, I found a lot more candid remarks than Asimov ever made about his mentor. There is a note that appears in Stanley Asimov's edited collection of Asimov's letters that states that we didn't correspond as much because of deep disagreement on social issues, which is as far as he goes with that comment. In a letter to scholar Alexei Panchin, which I don't think has been published, he was a little bit more frank. He said that the correspondence on American race relations had become so heated that it started to harm their friendship, and they decided to agree to disagree. And some of this information is found in the published version of the Campbell Letters. And Campbell says things that are also not in this book, which are sort of filling in some of the gaps. In a letter to Asimov about education, he says we shouldn't be arguing about access to education. White people are superior because they did everything in civilization without educational institutions. In fact, one of the things that they invented was the facilities for education. That is a proof of the real superiority of the white cultural selective breeding concept. So although in the print volume of Campbell's letters, you can find some similar ideas, it is in these letters that are found in the Asimov collection that are a little bit more direct. Writing to Asimov in 1962, he says that New York City students are unteachable, and the best that schools can do is to keep the teenagers off the streets. And he echoes this common racist idea that some people don't have the capacity for judgment, and if you ask them to fulfill their capacity for judgment, they will sort of go crazy, right? And the best that you can do for a New York City student is to train them in a Pavlovian manner to react to authority, to let somebody else do the thinking for him. And this is a bizarre thing to write to Isaac Asimov, because certainly Asimov went to New York City public schools, and his experience of going to school was in a segregated institution. So I can sort of understand why this letter didn't make it into the collection, although it does really show a very sharp line that Campbell would draw about race and education. What I like about this effort, though, is that it's also fun to look at people's responses to these racists and trying to figure out how we can respond to similar criticisms today. So this, many of Asimov's letters to Campbell do not appear in the edited collection by Stanley Asimov, which is a shame because they show Asimov to be very sensitive to racial justice issues. He's not particularly well known as being an egalitarian person with regard to gender, but in terms of race, he's quite astute, right? For instance, he tells Campbell, I know that you don't live your life as a racist, but the things that you publish in analog editorials and the stories you select for publication influence a lot of people's minds. And he goes on with a little personal portrait. I prefer the company of my books to other people, but when I do go out in public, I don't want to, I don't have the right to demand that everybody else be kicked out until I'm through just because I prefer to be alone. And so this obviously thinking about the legacy of Jim Crow laws in the South. Also, a later letter from that year addressed to Campbell shows Asimov's sensitivity about privilege. He says, supposing I was still myself, but I was born in Black in Africa, what would I do, right? Could I write science fiction? Would people read it if I published in Swahili? Who would buy it? Who would pay me? And it's an interesting kind of remark showing sort of the influence of privilege, and Asimov's awareness of it, right? The opportunity to be successful is not given to everybody. Not everybody has that opportunity to use the legacy of colonialism and sort of education in that way. And this, to me, I think is a really important insight into Asimov's work. He has a series of stories about race that did not get published by Campbell in Astounding. Campbell refused those stories, and they found their way into print elsewhere. Several of those stories involve this character named Tweenie, who is a half human, half Venus person. And so this idea of mixed race and this idea of challenging racial norms is something that Asimov took on in his fiction in his early days, and returned to again in his nonfiction essays later in his life. It's also kind of fun to look at the women who write to Asimov, and I think this is an interesting way to think about this era, right? Asimov writing or reading letters from women who refer to themselves as Mrs. and their husband's name. Occurs over and over again, and that certainly was a habit of the time. But the women who were using Asimov's nonfiction to educate themselves are also really notable in this collection. And then similar situation occurred with my research into Judith Merrill. Many authors like Daniel Wollheim have eliminated Merrill from their research. And if you look at some of the standard histories, people like Merril are missing, right? It seems to be, in Lester Del Rey's sort of book about science fiction, it seems to be a history of men in science fiction. And this to me is an interesting thing. I mean, is it only the sexism that's a problem, or is there something to say about the influence of other factors? Some of the Merrill's material is already available. She published a memoir close to the end of her life with her granddaughter. And it does include some letters and what there is to sort of gives you some directions on what to look for. It's curious to me that Merrill's papers ended up in Canada, in the Archives Canada, since she had such a fruitful, productive life in the United States. And is famous for being part of the Futurian Club and founding the Milford's Workshop in Pennsylvania. But in 1968, she moved to Toronto after some negative experiences and wanted to sort of help war resistors. And I think this is part of the story here, right? One of the things that leads to her erasure from science fiction is this acrimonious divorce from Frederick Pole, who was an important editor. If you look through her letters, you can see the sort of 10-year influence that this divorce had on her life, which started out with Pole's embezzlement of money from science fiction authors. The typical story about science fiction will say that Pole sort of revolutionized the payment structure for authors. The letters say that this is not true. Asimov writes to Pole many times looking for his money. Merril letters show Pole blaming Merril's mother because he had to send her so much money, but his mother never received any money. And this sort of opens up the divorce. In summer 1952, Pole tried to snatch his daughter away from Merril's arms, and Merril flees to Florida, but loses custody of both children at that time. And her effort for the next 7 years to get her daughter back really is testified to in her letters to her friends. But what was also notable to me is the betrayal of some of the people that had been her Futurian colleagues who testified against her for being immoral and unworthy of custody of her children. And so this sort of 10-year piece is missing, right? People don't really hear about this too much because I think Merril was trying to co-parent with Pole, and also all of her friends as Futurians were very influential, leading them to sort of silence this story. But it certainly is available to anybody who goes and takes a look at the letters. I also was intrigued, and I write a lot about this in the chapter on Merril, about her anti-supremacist vision of ESP, this idea that Homo superior had this superior intellect that allowed them to have ESP was sort of permeated science fiction by Campbell and people like Hubbard. But in the time after her divorce from Pole, Merril starts to regain her interest in ESP and initiates a correspondence with all the science fiction authors that she knows, leading to 2 book publications and also an anthology that she edited. And there's these letters that are really amazing. This letter that she wrote to Philip K. Dick's says, I really don't like these Superman theories. I was born and raised Jewish, which means that I sort of hate any elite and any intellectual rationale for Supermen. And she recounts this encounter that she had with Campbell in the early 1950s, who was trying to explain to her how Homo sapiens had this next stage of evolution called Homo superior. And this sort of puts a new twist on her interest in science fiction, which is much more egalitarian and something that's available to all people and not just this simple elite.
Chris, so sorry to interrupt. We're over 15 minutes, so if you maybe could just do a few sentence wrap up, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. This story is pretty well known about the AntiWar Ad in the Galaxy magazine and fantasy and science fiction. You can take a look at Bruce Franklin's essay here. But the correspondence really shows a much greater interest in this ad that Merril put into her, put her reputation on the line by sending out all these letters to get the information for the ad. So I think that the science fiction research often depends on unreliable sources like Pole, and the reticence of Asimov and Merril to talk about their true experience maybe is understandable, but the archives will prove to be an important resource for people seeking diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sorry that I talked too much. Thank you, Jill.
Thanks so much, Chris, and please don't be sorry. There's so much to say, and hopefully we'll have time to discuss further in the Q&A. But I do want to move to our final presenter of the panel, who is Jillian Pollack, who I had the pleasure of moderating her session last year on the archive. She is a Jewish Australian speculative fiction writer based in Canberra, and her paper today is entitled Story as Archive, How Speculative Fiction Novels Both Preserve and Interpret Cultural Material. So Jillian, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. And today I'm not here as a Jewish science fiction writer. I'm here with my historian hat on because I was an historian before I was, well, no, about the same time. I've had two careers in parallel, so they argue with each other from time to time. And this is really one of those arguments. So archives are seldom neutral players in historical interpretation. They're living and breathing parts of the cultures they archive and the ones they belong to. Considering the function of the archive and of the archivist, in fact, novels serve both as archives, they collect cultural material, and archivists interpreting cultural material. In fact, they collect cultural material systematically and they interpret cultural material with reasoning. So novels echo the repositories that are set up to interpret and to conserve them. Today, I like saying today when it's actually 2 o'clock in the morning here. Today, I'm going to explore how writers archive both culture and history in science fiction and in fantasy novels with one example of each. The texts that I'll use to illustrate the discussion are Claire G. Coleman's 2017 Terra Nullius and Ernest Favenk's, I can never say his name correctly, 1895, The Secret of the Australian Desert. Coleman's Terra Nullius is a science fiction novel set in Australia in the future, and Favenk's adventure fantasy is set in his own contemporary Australia just prior to Federation, that is to say in the final years of our colonial Australia, which was, we federated in 1901. Archives are excellent sources to seek out information about a place and a time within certain limitations. Archives are shaped and configured repositories for research, and these two novels can accurately be described as shaped and figured repositories for research. For example, Melissa Belanta and Robert Dixon both use Favenk in this way in their analyses of lost race novels. Dixon, in writing The Colonial Adventure, published 1995, discusses lost race novels, of which Favenk's work is some of the best known, and he discusses it as anxieties about identities. Claire Coleman's book is a textbook at a number of universities, mainly for its argument about modern Indigenous Australian identity and politics and its exploration of that through science fiction. Both books then are being mined for their resources exactly the way we do with ordinary archives. How books of the two writers are studied demonstrate the paths researchers take using archival resources. Favenk is often used to demonstrate the Australian landscape and how it was perceived in the late colonial period, while Coleman is mainly used to analyse and discuss politics and to fret over the troubling concept of terra nullius. And if you don't know terra nullius, ask me later because it's kind of important. However, Favenk includes political approaches in building his landscapes, and Coleman's novel is an excellent source of how space is viewed and used in the West. And by the West, I mean, of course, Western Australia with an overlay of Western culture. It's not the US West. We choose what basic information to extract from an archive, and we often depend very heavily on the nature of the archival artifacts to shape that interpretation. Novels are whole archives in a way because they contain the archive and the archivists and some of the interpretation. When we research them, we don't so much interrogate them as engage in discourse with them. It's like going to a perpetual conference when you wear that hat. Different archives give us different resources and contrasting material to examine. Popular nonfiction by both Favenk and Coleman help us interpret the views they present in the novels. Favenk was a professional explorer, that was his job, and he wrote books about the land he explored and he wrote reports into his work. He actively worked for the European Australia he argued as culturally superior in his fiction. His best known volume, in fact, is The History of Australian Exploration from 1788 to 1888, published in 1888. Coleman is current and very much a political activist, and her nonfiction includes articles that appear in literary magazines, in public newspapers, all over. She lives what she breathes, what she writes in Terra Nullius. And in Terra Nullius, Australia itself is the illustration of the changed conditions of a future Earth, conflated with the political and social attributes of society affected by alien invaders. Coleman creates a clearly colonial society with, and I quote, troopers, shopkeepers and merchants, missionaries and thieves, which pretty well sums up 19th century Australia. This is the nature of both repositories, 19th century Australia, and this is one of the core functions of archives. They store cultural artifacts archivally for preservation and for potential interrogation. And this paper is some of the interrogation. What we choose to store and the nature of the archive often pushes the answers in questions in a particular direction. When I worked at the Melbourne University Archive decades ago on documenting peace days, which is when I did my archival training, the work of a major peace activist was not included, despite our valiant attempts to include his work, because the activist in question was very senior in the university. He was the chancellor and did not want this element of his past preserved because it proved he'd once been left wing. He provided to me with 2 notes refusing to participate, and since the university archives could not take them because he was so reluctant, they're in my personal archive. Archivists take decisions, donors take decisions, researchers take decisions, and more. Funding and space and environment, and in this case, politics, can provoke decisions. Archives are never neutral places. Archives are critical to historians for their role as sources of understanding of a place and time. Each novel collects and interprets cultural material. Even if they're inventing new worlds, they're using the world the writer knows to base that invention on. And so they preserve this cultural material for the future, as we've seen in the last 2 panels. With the consideration and explanation one expects from a careful archivist, they're telling their story about this archive they've collected. The results are not without impact. My big example here is that Coleman questions canonicity, while Frederick crafts it. How does Coleman question canonicity? I'm so glad you asked. And I have, bad jokes at what I do in the early morning. Her novel is shaped like an historical novel initially, which causes the obvious interpretation of the story to be that the invasion described in the opening pages is by Europeans and in our past. The world is set up using a reconstruction of historical experiences faced by Indigenous Australians, which reinforces this assumption. It later becomes clear that the invaders are not from Earth, and I'm sorry about the spoiler. At that point, canon is turned upside down. This is why the book made such a big impact when it was published in Australia. The reader is encouraged to see the impact of invasion, regardless of the invasive species. How does Frederick craft canonicity? Bruce Pascoe in Dark Emu Black Seeds, which is quite controversial but very cool, describes Frederick as an explorer who took violent exception to the existence of Aboriginal people, wrote a novel where they were not the real occupiers of the soil prior to European arrival, but were preceded by a superior ancient civilization. Shades of H. Rider Haggard. The Secret of the Australian Desert, which is the novel, not the Explorer's Journal, is an adventure romance with cannibals, where the heroes are bored white men who, yes, thank you for introducing it, other people, they commit genocide as bored white men who are allowed to do this thing. For Venk's Indigenous Australians are called by demeaning terms directly and frequently with clear intent to describe a lower type of humanity. There is no doubting the insult or offensiveness. And I won't use the word because it's especially sensitive in North America. Indigenous Australians are definitely depicted as subservient. Add this world building to a moment in the novel where one of his characters gives his perfect dream to another. It's soon after the last of the Wallathas, the cannibalist tribe, is killed, and the white men congratulate themselves for ridding the land of the pest. The men look over the countryside, and in discussion of artesian water, one of them says, "I believe the end of the coming century will see it settled from east to west throughout." There are humans already in all the regions they've travelled. Frederick brought white Australia into his fiction. He helped increase its popular currency. This is appropriate because he helped bring problems into basically the articulation of early independence in Australia. So just as in Coleman's work, most aliens don't see the land they're settling. They walk across it, but they don't see it. For a considerable part of the journeys, Frederick actually demonstrates that the white men are travelling on existing paths. So there has to be settlement. What the adventurers see is something other than the land they travel through. This opens the archives up for new interpretations because 2 different novels demonstrate how land is seen by invaders and by those invaded. Both Frederick and Coleman become sources of understanding for colonialism and about Australians very much changing relationship with the UK, about our interpretation of First Peoples and new arrivals, about the roles of authors such as Kipling and H. Rider Haggard in providing templates for interpreting these matters. Objects in archives are often singled out by researchers for certain elements that they contain that bring a research subject to life. The most common subject for both of these novels, indicating its importance to those researching Australian speculative fiction, are, as I said a second ago, views of the culture of pre-European Australians. Because the Lost Race novels in particular assisted many in the British Empire to hide the living cultures from themselves and often to attempt to lose the cultures entirely, the genocide was not on paper, it was real. And being able to isolate the core research subjects helps us understand how these novels function within that archival context as part of the society the archive is preserving. How an archive is used can be just as important as what an archive contains. In looking at the shifts between the cultures that Vervenk includes and those used by Coleman, we discover that the effects of the White Australia policy linger, and the Australian concept of humanity is closely tied in with it. In Coleman's Terra Nullius, the humans occupy a very similar set of cultural niches to many of the non-cannibal Indigenous Australians in Vervenk's novel. Vervenk's novel shows us how severe cultural bias translates into fiction. Vervenk was writing at the same time as the attempted genocide in parts of Australia, which we don't talk about, so you may not have heard about. Fiction that claimed to be proud and white and extreme in its virtue. That is, Coleman shows us through science fiction that that elements of this are familiar even now. These are not the only interpretations of each novel by any means, nor of their authors' approaches. The wonder of the book as archive is that research questions change just with other archives, depending on the interlocutor, while the archive itself, the archival content remains stable. How novels are also archives is a complex and wondrous subject. 10 minutes is merely the whisper of an introduction to it. The reason I want to talk about it is it's related to my current work. I'm working on how novels transmit culture, and my second book on that, was published earlier this year in a book called Story Matrices. I've spoken on and written about both authors elsewhere, so seek me out if you want to know more. And I've put the books I referred to in this paper on my webpage. Thank you for letting me share my work with you, and I'm sorry for the occasional mumbling. It's now after 2 a.m. and I'm doing very well to be, I don't know, able to talk. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Jillian. I'm really impressed with your late night presentation. That was really great and raised a lot of really important questions that we heard also earlier in this panel about sort of the non-neutral, partial nature of the archive, the way that archives are always sort of involve curation and storytelling and world building, and how they don't just represent what is, right, but it's a partial view, and that also conditions what might be possible, and so therefore affects how we imagine and speculate as well. So there's so much to discuss here. Unfortunately, we are almost out of time. Jason has graciously granted us a few extra moments so we can take some Q&A that's happening. So I'm just going to go ahead and read the first question, which is from Jo Walton, and she says, Jessica, thank you for that fabulous talk. I'd like to ask about the categories of oppression that you found in these texts. Modern intersectional feminism includes characteristics like gender, race, class, ability, and other categories. Did you discover speculative forms of oppression or privilege, such as androids, telepaths, mutants, etc.? And if so, to what extent did these seem to be allegories or metaphors? And to what extent did they seem to be irreducible to real-world oppression and privilege? So if you want to address that, Jessica.
Yeah. So the short answer is a majority of the oppression I found was race or gender-based. And I think that was because of two reasons. First of all, I was focusing this project mostly on the Gernsback era, which is kind of the time from 1926 to like 35, 36-ish. And science fiction during that time has been widely accused of just being incredibly formulaic. And so a lot of the stories kind of follow the same structure where it's either this alien race is being like oppressed by another alien race or is facing problems from like a natural disaster and they need the humans to come in and save them, or otherwise these aliens are threatening the humans and the humans have to like exterminate them. And so a lot of these stories kind of set up like that idea of like xenophobia, but for other planets, as kind of the main conflict. And so that's why race was kind of the main form of, or racism is the main form of oppression I encountered in these stories. The second reason I think for why I mostly only found racism and sexism is because that's what I was looking for. It's a little self-selecting because I started this project looking through Everett Bleiler's anthology of Gernsback era stories, reading like a summary of, I think, more than 1,800 stories. And I went through the summary specifically looking for ones that mentioned like they have a female character or they're like topics of two races up against each other. And so that was what I was looking for. And because of that, I didn't really see like evidence of, or I guess conversations about like androids or mutants or other forms of oppression. I think it's probably present during the Gernsback era, but I do think that's likely something that comes in more after you get away from like the formulaic nature of Gernsback era stories.
Thanks so much, Jessica. If I could bring in another question, and if anybody else has questions, please type them in the chat. But this question is also from Joe. And Joe, I'm sorry if I said she before. I need a second cup of coffee, I think. But Joe has another question this time for Chris. And he says, other than those you mentioned, what are some of the major histories or critical works that have been especially influential, but whose reliability is in doubt? The answer may be, quote, needs more archival research. And in which case, what are your hunches about who the worst erasers have been?
Thank you, Joe. And just to build on what Jessica has been saying, there's been some really great work. She cited Helen Merrick's book, The Secret Feminist Cabal, which it has done a lot of good work to sort of rethink this time period. Lisa Yazik is in the audience. You'll be hearing from her soon. She's also one of the champions of sort of rethinking some of the errors people made about this earlier time. But in addition to Bleiler, who Jessica was just pointing out, has this anthology by fans, right? This sort of fan criticism belittles work by women and often omits work by women. And so there is this sort of feeling that there weren't many women authors who were worthwhile before 1970. Judith Merrill's husband, Frederick Pole, was one of the people who perpetuated this myth. Sort of understand his sort of bad feelings based on their divorce. And Eric Devine, in his book, Partners of Wonder, pointed out that it's ridiculous for Frederick Pole to say there were no important women writers in science fiction. So he had 3 marriages and all 3 of them were to science fiction writers, including Judith Merrill. And so these ideas that there wasn't a lot of diversity in science fiction have come down to us, even though it's clear that there has been a significant conversation about masculinity and race and globalization. I'm thinking of Brian Atterbury's book, Decoding Gender in Science Fiction, which is not too long ago, 2014, that said that said that men, it wasn't their fault that they were sexist. It was the spirit of the time, which is really clearly not true, right? The men were making these stories to try to define masculinity in a way that would eliminate women from being scientists or being science fiction authors. And so I think it's that legacy of this idea that there weren't many worthwhile science fiction authors or there wasn't an important discussion before 1970 is something that still needs to be challenged. Although, as I said, many people are doing that work.
Thanks so much, Chris. We do have to wrap up in just a minute, but I just wanted to bring Jillian back into the conversation. And Jillian, I was struck by something you said towards the end of your presentation, where you talked about like the research questions change with the interlocutor who asked the questions. I'm not sure if I'm getting that exactly right, but Your position is so fascinating because you're interrogating the archive as a historian and asking different questions, but you're also producing part of that cultural archive and artifacts by the written work you produce. So I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about how you see your own work as both writer and historian kind of intervening in this cultural production and preservation.
The reason I'm never going to write a best-selling novel is because my work always does that interrogation. So my fiction always argues with my research, which means you'll find things being tested. So The Green Children Help Out, my Jewish superhero novel, was because I was arguing with how do you create a world where Jews are not treated as a minority. A lot of worlds where Jews are the majority people, they're still acting like minority people. And I wanted to actually discover whether that could be pushed with a culture where the minority that was rebelling was the Christian minority. And so I wrote a whole novel because there's a lot more fun things you can do than just one, but it also helped me test the concept of how do we see our own world. So I'm not sure it makes good novels, but it makes for a really strong interlocking thing between, yes, you can look at my research, and I have a book to show, and things like this, and you can see exactly where there are 3 chapters in Story Matrices, which you can see spell out a lot of the stuff that happens in the Year of the Fruitcake, for example. So yeah, it's 100%. They're not tangled, they work together, they interrogate each other.
Great, thanks so much for sharing that further thought. And I do see that there's other questions in the Q&A, but unfortunately we do need to move on. But I want to invite anybody and everybody who still has questions to ask them again in the chat to our panelists. We can continue the conversation there. Thank you so much to Jessica and Chris and Jillian for these really provocative and fascinating presentations. And thanks everybody for listening. And I look forward to continuing the conversation throughout the day. So thanks again, everybody.
Thanks, Jill, Chris, Julian, and Jessica. That was some really great presentations, and I enjoyed the Q&A. You're judging from the response in chat and Q&A. I think other people are really starting to dig these ideas that we're talking about today. So we're going to switch gears now to talk about 2 specific archives, the Georgia Tech Science Fiction Collection and the City Tech Science Fiction Collection. So give me a moment to get that set up. And we'll take that away in just a moment. But also just to remind everyone that's joining us now, at the bottom of your webinar window, you can use the reactions if you want to applaud, because I know that this is like an awkward and weird experience having a symposia or a conference as a virtual event, but you can acknowledge folks by using the reactions for clapping, ta-da, and of course also use the chat for discussion and the Q&A or question and answer button for posing questions and points to the panelists. So we'll get started with the next session in just a moment.